In the year 1901, a group of sponge divers off the coast of a tiny Greek island made a discovery so strange that even they didn't understand what they were looking at. 60 meters below the surface of the Aegean Sea, wedged inside the wreck of an ancient cargo ship, they found a lump of corroded bronze roughly the size of a shoebox. It looked like nothing, a chunk of green, calcified rock, fused together by 2,000 years underwater. Nobody on that boat could have guessed that inside that unremarkable lump was a machine so advanced that historians would spend the next century trying to explain how it was even possible. And today, more than 120 years later, that machine is still not fully understood. Roughly 2/3 of it is gone forever, lost to time, corrosion, and the sea. But a question has been spreading fast across the internet in the last year. Has artificial intelligence finally cracked the missing half? Has something like Grok, the AI system built by xAI, actually reconstructed the lost portion of the Antikythera Mechanism and revealed what it was built to calculate? That claim has been circulating across dozens of videos and articles, often with dramatic titles promising to shock historians or reveal secrets that will terrify the scientific community. Before we go any further, you deserve the truth, because the real story here is stranger, more careful, and ultimately more impressive than the viral headlines suggest. Let's start with what actually happened in 1901, because the discovery itself is one of the great accidents of archaeology. The ship that sank off Antikythera was a Roman-era vessel, likely traveling from the eastern Mediterranean toward Italy, loaded with luxury cargo. Bronze and marble statues, glassware, jewelry, and coins were found scattered across the wreck site, suggesting the ship was probably carrying looted or purchased Greek treasures westward, likely sometime in the 1st century BCE. The Druyar, Heck itself, sat on a steep underwater slope, which likely helped preserve it from centuries of trawling and disturbance, and it wasn't until sponge divers working under dangerous conditions with primitive diving suits stumbled across it while sheltering from a storm that anyone even knew the ship existed. Among that cargo, almost as an afterthought, was a small wooden box containing a mechanism made of at least 30 bronze gears. When it was first pulled from the sea and brought to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, researchers assumed it was some kind of astronomical clock, but the technology it implied seemed almost impossible for its time. Nothing built with that level of gear complexity was known to exist again for well over 1,000 years, not until the mechanical astronomical clocks of medieval Europe. For decades, the device sat largely misunderstood, treated as an interesting but low-priority curiosity, its corroded fragments too fragile and too tangled to make sense of using the tools available at the time. Part of the problem was skepticism itself, the idea that a civilization from more than 2,000 years ago could have built anything with precision gearing simply didn't fit the accepted timeline of technological history that historians had constructed. Gearing of that complexity wasn't supposed to exist again until medieval European clockmakers began experimenting with escapements over a millennium later. So for much of the early 20th century, the Antikythera fragments sat quietly in a museum drawer, admired but largely unexplained, while the wider archaeological world focused its attention elsewhere. It took a particular kind of stubbornness, and eventually the right imaging technology, to finally take the object seriously enough to unravel it properly. The real breakthrough in understanding didn't come until the 20th century was almost over, and it came through imaging technology rather than physical excavation. In the 1970s, the physicist Derek de Solla Price used light X-ray imaging to peer inside the corroded fragments and proposed for the first time that the device functioned as a kind of analog calendar computer, capable of tracking astronomical cycles. But the true leap came in 2005, when a research consortium brought in two very different pieces of specialized equipment. The first was a massive 8-ton X-ray computed tomography scanner, built specifically for this project by the imaging company X-Tech Systems, in partnership with Hewlett-Packard. This machine allowed researchers to see through the layers of corroded bronze without touching or damaging the fragments, revealing gear teeth, pin placements, and even engraved text buried under 2,000 years of mineral buildup. The second tool was called polynomial texture mapping, a photographic technique that uses light from dozens of different angles to reveal microscopic surface detail invisible to the naked eye. Together, these two technologies did something remarkable. They let scientists read text that no human had seen since antiquity, inscribed in tiny Greek characters, some letters barely more than a millimeter tall, covering the mechanism's outer plates like an instruction manual. What that combined imaging revealed, published in a landmark 2006 paper in the journal Nature by researchers Tony Freeth, Mike Edmonds, and their colleagues, reshaped how the entire scientific community understood the object. The Antikythera mechanism wasn't simply a calendar. It was an astronomical calculator of extraordinary sophistication, built to model the movements of celestial bodies using a differential gear train, a mechanical concept that wasn't supposed to reappear in engineering history until the 16th century. On the front of the device sat a large dial representing the zodiac and the Egyptian calendar, with a pointer showing the sun's position and a second pointer, driven by a small rotating mechanism showing the moon's position and even its changing phase through a tiny half-silvered, half-blackened ball that rotated to mimic the moon's illumination. On the back, two large spiral dials tracked far longer cycles. One followed the Metonic cycle, a 19-year pattern the ancient Greeks used to reconcile the lunar calendar with the solar year, subdivided further to track the 4-year cycle of the Panhellenic Games, including the Olympics. The other back dial tracked the Saros Ci. Cli, a 223 lunar month period used to predict eclipses, complete with tiny engraved glyphs marking exactly when and what kind of eclipse would occur, and even estimating the hour. The engineering required to make this work mechanically, rather than through pure calculation on paper, is what still leaves modern engineers stunned. A differential gear train, the same basic principle used centuries later in automobile transmissions, allowed the device to combine two separate rotational inputs, representing the sun's motion, d the moon's motion, into a single output showing the moon's phase relative to the sun. Building that kind of mechanism today with computer-aided design and precision milling machines is straightforward. Building it by hand, with bronze, a saw, a file, and geometric calculation alone, sometime around the 2nd century BCE, is a completely different achievement, and it's part of why the device took so long for modern scholars to fully believe. This is where the real complexity begins, and where the missing pieces come in. The device that survived, spread across 82 separate fragments, represents only a fraction of what the mechanism originally contained. The largest and most complete piece, known as Fragment A, holds the bulk of the surviving gear train, but researchers estimate the complete mechanism likely had somewhere around 37 gears in total, and only about 30 have ever been identified with confidence. The front-facing planetary display, the part of the mechanism many researchers believe once modeled the movements of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn against the fixed backdrop of the zodiac, is almost entirely gone. What survives are fragments of the inscriptions that described it, cryptic, references to planetary periods, and the faint mechanical evidence of gearing that would have needed to exist to drive such a display. For over a century, that absence was one of the field's most frustrating unknowns. Scholars could see that the mechanism was built to do more than track the sun and moon. They just couldn't prove exactly how. That changed, at least partially, in 2021, when a team from University College London, led by mechanical engineer Tony Freeth, alongside colleagues Adam Wojcik and David Higgin, published a new model in the journal Scientific Reports. Rather than relying on guesswork, they combined the surviving inscriptions, the known gear ratios from the back of the device, and ancient Greek astronomical theory, particularly cycles associated with the philosopher Parmenides, describing planetary periods such as Venus repeating its pattern relative to Earth roughly every 462 years and Saturn every 442 years. Using those numbers, the UCL team proposed a gear train design that could plausibly have driven a planetarium-like FRONT display, showing the 5 planets known to the ancient world moving in their correct relative positions, including the strange backward loop known as retrograde motion, which had puzzled astronomers since antiquity. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary piece of scholarship, but it's important to be precise about what it actually was. It was a proposed reconstruction, a best-fit mathematical and mechanical model built to be consistent with the surviving evidence. It was not a certainty, and the team themselves described it as their most probable solution rather than a proven fact. Since then, engineers including hobbyist clockmakers have built working physical replicas based on this model, and they function beautifully, which is strong supporting evidence. But there is no surviving artifact that lets historians simply confirm every detail. So where does that leave the claim making the rounds online? The one saying an AI system, specifically Grok, has now finished the job and fully reconstructed the missing half. After digging through the sources behind that claim, the honest answer is that there is no verified event behind it. What appears to be circulating is a wave of AI-generated video scripts and content farm articles, many of them nearly identical in wording, dramatically announcing a discovery that isn't documented in any peer-reviewed research, any statement from the Antikythera Mechanism research project, or any credible archaeological or scientific institution. Some of these very videos even carry disclaimers buried in their descriptions, admitting the content is for entertainment purposes and shouldn't be taken as factual. That doesn't mean the idea is worthless, though, because it points to something genuinely fascinating happening right now in the real world of archaeology, something that makes the fantasy almost believable. Artificial intelligence really is being used to recover lost ancient texts and structures that were, until very recently, considered permanently unreadable. And the best example of that isn't the Antikythera Mechanism at all. It's a library that was buried by a volcano. In 79 CE, when Mount Vesuvius erupted and destroyed the city of Pompeii, it also buried a nearby villa in the town of Herculaneum, a luxury residence believed to have belonged to the family of Julius Caesar's father-in-law. Inside that villa sat a private library containing hundreds of papyrus scrolls, texts of Greek and Roman philosophy, most of them believed to be lost forever in most other copies. The eruption carbonized the scrolls instantly, turning delicate papyrus into brittle, blackened cylinders of ash that looked less like books and more like lumps of charcoal. When they were rediscovered in the 18th century, early attempts to physically unroll them destroyed most of what was tried, crumbling priceless ancient text into dust. For over 200 years, hundreds of these scrolls sat in museum collections in Naples, unread, considered too fragile to ever open. That changed because of a project called the Vesuvius Challenge, launched in 2023 by entrepreneur Nat Friedman, computer scientist Daniel Gruss, and Brent Seals, a computer science professor at the University of Kentucky, who had already spent years developing what he called virtual unwrapping techniques. Their approach was to scan the intact, rolled-up scrolls using high-resolution X-ray computed tomography, essentially the same category of scanning technology used on the Antikythera fragments, capturing an extraordinarily detailed 3D map of the scroll's internal structure without ever physically opening it. But scanning alone wasn't enough, because the carbonized ink and the carbonized papyrus were made of nearly identical material, virtually invisible to each other in a normal scan. The ink left no visible pigment difference. What it did leave was an incredibly subtle change in surface texture, a slight cracking pattern where the ink had once been. Applied, undetectable to the human eye, but potentially detectable by a machine learning model trained specifically to recognize it. The Vesuvius Challenge team released the scan data publicly and offered cash prizes to any researcher or programmer who could train an AI model to reliably detect that pattern and reconstruct legible text. In October of 2023, a 21-year-old computer science student named Luke Ferreter, working with a partner named Youssef Nader, achieved the first major breakthrough, training a neural network that successfully identified a single readable word buried inside the digital scan of a scroll that hadn't been read in nearly 2,000 years. That word was the Greek word for purple. It might sound like a small thing, but it proved the entire concept worked. By the end of that year, a combined team, including Nader, Ferreter, and a Swiss robotics student named Julian Schilliger, had extracted more than 2,000 readable Greek characters from a single scroll, enough to reveal the outline of a philosophical text believed to be written by the Epicurean philosopher Philodemus, discussing pleasure, music, and how to live a good life. The Vesuvius Challenge continue. As today, and it stands as one of the clearest, most rigorously documented examples of AI genuinely solving a problem that had defeated scholars for 2 centuries. No as published, it's peer-reviewed in parts, and it's ongoing. Since that first breakthrough, the project has expanded to scan and attempt to read dozens more scrolls from the same collection, and the techniques involved have continued to improve, with newer models trained on larger datasets producing cleaner, more confident text reconstructions. Classicists who once assumed these scrolls were permanently lost are now cautiously preparing for the possibility of reading entire previously unknown philosophical works, texts that haven't been read by anyone since the eruption that buried them. That is the kind of claim that actually deserves the word unprecedented, and it earned that description the hard way, through transparent, replicable results, rather than a single dramatic headline. That real achievement is exactly why the fictional Antikythera claim spread so easily. It sits right next to a true story that sounds almost identical in structure. Buried ancient technology, considered unreadable for centuries, cracked open by a machine learning model trained to spot patterns invisible to human researchers. The Vesuvius Challenge proves that kind of breakthrough is absolutely within reach of current technology. It is entirely plausible that a similar approach, high-resolution scanning combined with machine learning pattern recognition, could eventually be applied more rigorously to the remaining Antikythera fragments, refining the inscriptions further, tightening the gear ratio calculations, and strengthening confidence in models like the one UCL proposed in 2021. Some research teams have in fact already discussed using computational modeling and simulation to test different reconstructions of the front dial mechanically, checking whether a proposed gear train would even physically function without jamming, given the tolerances achievable with ancient Greek bronze casting and hand filing techniques. That is real, careful, ongoing science. It's simply not the same as a single dramatic announcement that the mystery has been definitively solved. It's also worth understanding just how difficult the remaining puzzle actually is, because it puts the scale of the challenge into perspective. The 82 surviving fragments range enormously in size, from fragment A, which is large enough to contain dozens of visible gear teeth, down to fragments so small and corroded that researchers have spent years simply trying to determine which side is the front and which is the back. Bronze corrodes in seawater through a process that gradually converts the metal into a mineral compound. And while that process can sometimes preserve fine surface detail in a strange, almost fossilized way, it also permanently destroys the mechanical integrity of the object. None of the surviving gears can simply be turned by hand anymore to see what they do. Every conclusion about how the mechanism functioned has to be inferred indirectly by counting teeth through a CT scan, measuring the spacing of pinholes, and cross-referencing that data against the fragments of inscription that describe what each dial was supposed to show. It's less like solving a jigsaw puzzle and more like reconstructing a symphony from a handful of surviving instrument parts and a few scorched pages of the sheet music. So let's talk honestly about what a genuinely completed reconstruction, if the evidence eventually supports one, would actually mean, because even the responsible peer-reviewed version of this story is stunning enough without embellishment. If the UCL planetary model, or something close to it, is correct, then the Antikythera Mechanism was not just tracking the sun and moon. It was displaying the positions of all 5 planets visible to the naked eye, showing their retrograde loops through the zodiac, essentially functioning as a hand-cranked mechanical simulation of the entire known solar system as the ancient Greeks understood it, geocentric model and all. Combined with its lunar and solar dials, its eclipse predictor, and its 4-year athletic games calendar, that would make it not simply a clock, but arguably the world's first known analog computer, a device built to take known astronomical cycles and project them forward or backward in time, through mechanical calculation rather than pure observation. The sheer number of interlocking GE gears required, the precision of the tooth cutting, some teeth measured at under 2 millimeters, and the mathematical sophistication behind cycles like the Metonic and Saros calendars all point to a level of engineering knowledge that historians once assumed didn't exist until well over 1,000 years later. What makes this even more remarkable and slightly unsettling if you think about it long enough is what it implies about lost knowledge. The Antikythera Mechanism wasn't a one-off miracle invented in isolation. Ancient writers, including the Roman philosopher Cicero, described similar planetary models built by the astronomer and mathematician Archimedes and other Hellenistic engineers, devices that were apparently well known enough in their time to be mentioned casually in surviving texts, yet almost none of them physically survived. That suggests the Antikythera Mechanism wasn't the peak of some singular genius working alone. It was likely a known category of device, part of a broader tradition of Hellenistic mechanical astronomy that has almost entirely vanished from the archaeological record, mostly because bronze was valuable and was routinely melted down and reused throughout history, and because most complex mechanical objects simply don't survive shipwrecks, fires, and 2,000 years of decay. The only reason we have this one at all is a shipwreck that happened to sink in exactly the right conditions, deep and cold enough to slow the corrosion just enough for pieces of the puzzle to survive into the modern era. It is entirely possible, and honestly likely, that other devices like it, some perhaps even more advanced, existed and simply left no trace at all. Bronze in particular was almost always recycled in antiquity, melted down for coinage, weapons, or new tools whenever metal became scarce, which means the very material that made these devices possible is also the reason so few of them survived to be studied at all. The Antikythera Mechanism may not be a miracle of singular invention so much as a rare survivor, one of a kind, only because it happened to sink in the sea instead of ending up in a foundry. That is a sobering thought. Technological progress isn't always a straight line moving steadily upward. Sometimes it's a series of peaks and valleys, brilliant achievements that get lost, forgotten, or destroyed, only for humanity to slowly rediscover, centuries later, ideas that had already been figured out once before. Consider how differently the story of Western science might be told if devices like the Antikythera Mechanism had survived in greater numbers, if the knowledge behind them had been written down, copied, and passed forward the way Euclid's geometry or Ptolemy's astronomy eventually were. Instead, this particular thread of mechanical engineering seems to have simply died out, perhaps disrupted by the political chaos of the late Roman Republic, perhaps lost when the Library of Alexandria and other centers of learning were damaged or destroyed over the following centuries, perhaps simply forgotten as the specific craftsmen who knew how to build such things passed away without training enough successors. Knowledge, unlike stone monuments, is fragile in a way that's easy to underestimate. It doesn't require a catastrophe to disappear. It only requires a broken chain of teaching, one generation that doesn't pass a skill on to the next. Circling back to where we started, the truth about Grok, artificial intelligence, and the Antikythera Mechanism is more nuanced than any viral headline wants it to be. No credible evidence currently shows that an AI system has completed a verified reconstruction of the mechanism's missing half. and viewers should treat those specific claims with healthy skepticism until real institutions like the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, UCL, or a peer-reviewed journal actually confirm something new. What is real, and arguably more exciting because it's true, is that artificial intelligence has already proven, through a separate but strikingly similar project, that it is capable of recovering ancient knowledge that human eyes alone could never have retrieved. The Vesuvius challenge didn't need dramatic clickbait to be one of the most astonishing archaeological breakthroughs of the decade. It earned that title through published results, replicated methods, and text that scholars can now actually read and debate. That's the standard the Antikythera Mechanism deserves too, and archaeology is advancing. It's entirely plausible that within the next few years, a genuinely verified, scientifically confirmed model of the mechanism's complete gear train, planetary display included, could finally exist. Researchers involved in the ongoing study of the fragments have continued to push for higher resolution scanning and more sophisticated computational simulation. And it's not unreasonable to think that machine learning tools, trained specifically on ancient Greek epigraphy, the way the Vesuvius challenge models were trained on Carbonese ed ink, could eventually help fill in fragmentary inscriptions with far more confidence than human researchers working alone. When that day comes, it won't need a shocking title to get your attention. The engineering alone, 2,000 years old and still capable of humbling modern scientists, will do that on its own. There's also a broader lesson buried in this story, one that has nothing to do with gears or eclipses. In an age where a headline can be generated, published, and pushed to millions of viewers before a single fact is checked, the burden of separating real discovery from manufactured spectacle increasingly falls on the audience itself. That doesn't mean every viral claim is false, and it doesn't mean skepticism should curdle into cynicism about genuine breakthroughs. Because as the Vesuvius challenge shows, some of these stories really are true, really are extraordinary, and really do deserve the excitement they generate. The skill worth building isn't distrust. It's the habit of asking where a claim actually came from, who published it, and whether it can be traced back to an institution, a paper, or a named researcher willing to put their name behind it. That single habit would have been enough to catch the grok claim the moment it appeared, and it's the same habit that will serve you well the next time a truly remarkable discovery, ancient or otherwise, shows up in your feed. If this kind of deep dive into real history, real science, and the line between genuine discovery and viral exaggeration is something you want more of, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment letting me know whether you'd want a full breakdown of the Vesuvius challenge and how those scrolls are actually being read today. Hit the like button if you learned something you didn't expect. Share this with someone who's obsessed with ancient technology or AI, and stick around, because the real story of how a 2,000-year-old machine keeps outsmarting modern science is only getting started.